Have you ever stood in your own driveway and realized you were a complete stranger to the people who share your last name? I'm talking about that gut-wrenching, bone-chilling realization that the empire you built, every brick, every dollar, every late night, was just a gilded cage they were waiting for you to die in. My name is Holden, and not too long ago, I was the man whose signature could move markets and change lives. I lived in a mansion that looked like a museum, married a woman who looked like a queen, and raised children who I thought were my greatest legacy. But I was living a lie so deep that it nearly cost me my life. I want to ask you something before I go any further, and please be honest in the comments. Have you ever felt like a walking bank account? Have you ever looked at your partner or your kids and seen a flicker of something? Cold. Like they were just checking their watches waiting for the inheritance to kick in. Let me know where you're watching from because I need to know if this kind of betrayal is as universal as it feels right now. And if this story hits home, hit that subscribe button because the truth I'm about to tell you is the only reason I'm still breathing. It all started with the crash. I remember the smell of the leather in my SUV, the way the rain was hitting the windshield like 1,000 tiny needles. I was driving home late from a board meeting, thinking about the vacation I wanted to take Madeline and the kids on. Then nothing. The steering went loose. The brakes, those high-end, top-of-the-line brakes, simply weren't there. I remember the scream of tires that wasn't mine, the world spinning until the sky and the asphalt traded places, and the sickening crunch of metal folding around me like paper. As I lay there trapped in a tomb of glass and steel, I saw a pair of headlights stop at the top of the ridge. Someone watched me crawl out of that wreckage bleeding and broken, and they didn't call 911. They just drove away. The world thinks Holden is dead, or missing, or a ghost. I spent 3 weeks in a dingy clinic 3 towns over paying in cash I kept in my emergency kit, watching the news from a flickering TV. I saw Madeline on the screen dabbing her eyes with a silk handkerchief that cost more than the nurse's monthly salary. I saw my son Preston looking distraught in front of the cameras. But I knew that look. It wasn't grief, it was relief. I didn't go back. Not as the CEO. I used the scars on my face and a cheap, ragged beard to transform myself. I traded my bespoke suits for stained denim and my gold watch for dirt under my fingernails. I became a ghost in my own garden. My estate is so large that the staff changes every few months, and the new gardener was just another face to ignore. The morning I walked back onto the property as a hired hand, the air felt different. It smelled like wet grass and expensive perfume. I was assigned to the north rose bushes right under the terrace where we used to have Sunday brunch. I was hunching my shoulders, keeping my head down my heart, hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I was terrified they would recognize my eyes the way I walk anything. Then the French doors opened. Madeline stepped out. She looked breathtaking. She wasn't wearing black. She was wearing a vibrant floral dress that screamed, "New beginnings." She didn't even glance toward the gardens. To her, I was just a shape in the distance, a tool to keep the hedges straight. A moment later, Preston walked out behind her. He was tossing his car keys, the keys to the vintage Jaguar I'd spent 3 years restoring, up in the air, with a smug grin. "Did the insurance check clear yet?" Preston asked, his voice carrying perfectly in the crisp morning air. Madeline laughed, a sound that used to be my favorite melody, but now felt like a serrated blade across my skin. "Patience, darling. There are protocols, but the house is ours now. That's what matters." I gripped the shears so hard my knuckles turned white. My own son, the boy I'd taught to ride a bike on this very lawn, didn't even mention my name. They were talking about me like I was a bad debt they'd finally settled. I felt a surge of Zheilong, that heart-shredding pain that makes you want to scream until your lungs burst. But I stayed silent. I bent lower, clipping a dead branch from a bush I'd planted for our 10th anniversary. The humiliation was just beginning. Later that afternoon, Skylar, my daughter, came out to the pool area. She's only 16, but she's already learned how to look through people like they're made of glass. She dropped her towel right next to where I was working, not even bothering to see if I was in the way. "Hey, gardener," she snapped, her eyes never leaving her phone. "Move that bucket. It's blocking my light." I didn't move fast enough. I couldn't. My ribs were still screaming from the accident. "Are you deaf?" she sighed, finally looking at me. For a second, our eyes met. My heart stopped. I waited for the recognition, the gasp, the dad. But she just curled her lip in disgust at my scarred cheek, and the dirt on my brow. God, you're gross. Mom really needs to hire better-looking help. Get out of here. I picked up the bucket and shuffled away, my head bowed. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. I had spent my life building a fortress to protect these people, and now that very fortress was where I was being treated like trash. I went back to the small, cramped shack at the edge of the woods, the place where the help stayed. It was a far cry from the 800 thread count sheets I was used to. The air was damp, and the bed was a thin mattress that smelled of dust. As the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the estate, I sat on the porch of that shack. I watched the lights flicker on in the main house. I saw the silhouettes of my family moving behind the curtains. They were sitting down to dinner. My chair was empty, but the laughter I heard through the open windows told me no one missed the man who should have been sitting there. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled photograph I'd managed to save from the wreck. It was a picture of us at the beach 5 years ago. We looked so happy. I looked at Madeline's smiling face in the photo, and then looked up at the window where she was currently pouring a glass of wine for a man whose silhouette I didn't recognize. The pain was being replaced by something else. A cold, hard stone was forming in my gut. I realized that my death was the best thing that ever happened to them. They weren't mourning Holden. They were celebrating the disappearance of the man who held the purse strings. I spent the next few hours walking the perimeter of the property in the dark, my boots sinking into the soft earth. I knew every inch of this land. I knew where the security cameras had blind spots because I had designed the system. I knew where the spare keys were hidden in the faux rock by the service entrance. I was a prisoner in my own kingdom, watching the usurpers feast at my table. The night air turned cold, a biting chill that seeped through my thin jacket. I found myself standing near the back patio, hidden behind a thicket of overgrown ivy. The glass doors were cracked open to let in the breeze. I could hear the clink of silverware and the low murmur of conversation. I crept closer, my breath shallow. I wasn't just a gardener anymore. I was a witness. I was the silent observer of my own funeral. I saw Preston leaning back in his chair, a glass of expensive bourbon in his hand. My bourbon. He looked so comfortable, so entitled. To the future, Xavier's voice rang out. I recognized him instantly, my lead counsel, the man I trusted with my legal affairs. He was sitting in my seat. He reached across the table and squeezed Madeline's hand. To the future, Madeline echoed, her voice dripping with a satisfaction that made my blood run cold. I stood there in the shadows, the dirt of the garden under my nails, and the weight of 1,000 betrayals on my shoulders. I watched as Xavier leaned in and whispered something into Madeline's ear that made her throw her head back and laugh. The sound echoed across the dark patio, chilling me to the bone. I turned away, my boots crunching softly on the gravel path. As I retreated into the absolute darkness of the trees, the image of their joined hands burned into my mind like a brand. The darkness of the estate felt heavier than the soil I'd been tilling all day, a suffocating shroud that seemed to swallow the very air in my lungs. I retreated toward the service quarters, my footsteps ghosting over the gravel, each crunch sounding like a gunshot in the silence of my own betrayal. That laughter from the terrace, Madeline's laughter, clung to my skin like a layer of grime I couldn't wash off. It wasn't just the sound of a woman moving on, it was the sound of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. I reached the small, dilapidated shack, the wood groaning as I leaned against the doorframe, looking back at the glowing mausoleum I used to call home. I have to ask you guys, have you ever seen a side of someone that completely erased every good memory you had of them? Like a light switch flipping, and suddenly the person you shared a bed with for 20 years is a total stranger with a heart of ice. Drop a comment and tell me if you've ever had that moment of clarity where the mask finally slips. It's a lonely feeling, isn't it? If you're riding with me through this nightmare, make sure you're subscribed. Because what I found next changed me from a victim into something else entirely. Sleep didn't come. My ribs throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, a physical echo of the SUV tumbling down that ravine. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Xavier's hand on Madeline's, his thumb stroking her knuckles in my chair at my table in my life. By 4 a.m., the restlessness drove me out. I didn't head for the gardens. Instead, I drifted toward the pool house, a modern glass structure tucked away in the shadows of the weeping willows. As the new guy, I'd been told to stay away from the guest areas, but I knew the maintenance codes. I crept inside, the smell of chlorine and expensive candles hitting me. I wasn't looking for a swim. I was looking for answers. I remembered Madeline spent hours here, meditating, in the months leading up to my accident. My eyes scanned the sleek minimalist cabinets until I found the one behind the bar, the one with the false back I'd installed years ago to hide a small safe. The safe was gone. In its place was a medical organizer, the kind doctors use for high-stakes prescriptions. I pulled it out, my hands trembling. Inside were dozens of small amber glass vials. None of them had official labels. Just handwritten codes. M1, M2, H final. My blood turned to liquid nitrogen. H final. I opened one and took a cautious sniff. It was odorless, but there was a faint metallic tang that made the hair on my arm stand up. I thought back to the brain fog I'd been experiencing for 6 months. The sudden dizzy spells at the office. The way my heart would skip beats while I was sitting perfectly still. My doctors had called it executive burnout. They told me I needed a vacation. Madeline had been so supportive, always bringing me my morning green juice, kissing my forehead, telling me to just drink up and rest, Holden. I was being erased. Long before the car went over the cliff, they were dissolving me from the inside out. I slumped onto the cold tile floor, clutching that vial like a cursed talisman. The accident wasn't a stroke of bad luck, it was a backup plan because I was taking too long to die. The sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange. I had to get back to the gardens before the head groundskeeper did his rounds. I tucked 2 of the vials into the hidden pocket of my work vest and wiped the cabinet clean. The next few days were a blur of manual labor and psychological torture. I forced myself to work near the patio, to be the invisible man they ignored while they plotted their new life. I watched Xavier arrive every morning at 10 a.m., carrying a leather briefcase that used to belong to me. He acted like the master of the house, shouting orders at the staff and complaining about the low-class smell of the mulch I was spreading. One afternoon, I was trimming the boxwoods near the outdoor dining area when Madeline and Xavier sat down for a light lunch. They were leaning in close, their voices hushed but carrying on the wind. "The probate judge is asking for more documentation on the missing person status," Xavier muttered, leaning back and sipping a chilled Chardonnay. "If Holden's body doesn't turn up in the next 6 months, we might have to fight for the accelerated payout." Madeline sighed, picking at a salad. "It's been weeks, Xavier. That ravine is deep and the river was high that night. He's fish food by now. Can't you just pull some strings? You said the firm had the judge in their pocket." "I'm working on it, Lena. But we have to be careful. If we look too eager, people start asking why a billionaire's car had brake fluid levels that vanished overnight." I froze, the shears hovering inches from a branch. Brake fluid. They didn't just hope I'd crash, they insured it. "Preston is getting jumpy," Madeline added, her voice dropping an octave. "He keeps asking if we're sure no one saw him that night. He's 18, Xavier. He's a child. He shouldn't have had to do the heavy lifting. He did what was necessary for his inheritance," Xavier snapped. "He wanted that Lamborghini. Now he's got it. Tell him to keep his mouth shut and enjoy the ride." The world tilted. I felt a surge of "Noi Jiao Se Long," not for my lost wealth, not for my cheating wife, but for the boy I used to hold in my arms. My son. My own flesh and blood had crawled under my car with a wrench and a heart full of greed. He wasn't a victim of his mother's manipulation. He was a willing executioner. I felt a hot, stinging sensation in my eyes, the first tears I'd shed since the crash. They weren't tears of grief. They were tears of a father mourning a son who never truly existed. I had raised a monster in a designer suit. "Hey, you old man." The sharp bark of a voice snapped me back to the present. I looked up to see Preston standing over me, his hands on his hips. He was wearing a polo shirt that cost $300 and a look of pure arrogance. "I told you yesterday to clear the debris from the driveway," he sneered, kicking a pile of clippings toward my face. "My friends are coming over with their cars, and I don't want your trash scratching their rims. Do your job, or I'll have my mom kick you back to whatever gutter you crawled out of." I stared at his shoes, the limited edition sneakers I'd bought him for his birthday. I wanted to stand up. I wanted to grab him by the collar and scream, "I'm your father, I gave you everything, but I didn't." I stayed on my knees. I felt the rough texture of the dirt under my palms, the grit of the reality I now lived in. "I'm sorry, sir." I rasped, my voice sounding like gravel grinding together. "It won't happen again." He scoffed, turning on his heel. Whatever. Just stay out of sight. You're an eyesore. I watched him walk away, his stride full of unearned confidence. He had no idea that the eyesore was the man who held the keys to the secret offshore accounts he didn't even know existed. He had no idea that the trash was currently calculating the exact cost of his soul. That evening, the air turned humid and heavy, the kind of weather that precedes a violent storm. I went back to my shack, but I didn't sit on the porch. I knelt by the loose floorboard in the corner, the one under the rusted metal locker. I pried it up, reaching into the dark cavity. My fingers brushed against the cold, smooth surface of a waterproof Pelican case. I pulled it out and clicked the latches open. Inside wasn't jewelry or gold. It was a satellite phone, 3 burner passports, and stacks of high-denomination bills, nearly $2 million in cold hard cash. This was my scorched earth fund, something I'd set up years ago when I first started sensing the vultures circling the company. I never thought the vultures would be the people sleeping under my roof. I pulled out the satellite phone and powered it on. The blue light of the screen felt like a beacon in the dark room. I stared at the keypad, my mind racing. I could call the police, I could call the FBI. But Xavier was a master of the legal system, and Madeline was the grieving widow everyone loved. They would tie me up in court for years, and with the H-final toxin already in my system, I didn't know how much time I had left. The storm finally broke. A flash of lightning illuminated the shack, followed by a crack of thunder that shook the walls. I looked at the vials on the table, then at the stacks of cash, and finally at the reflection of my scarred, unrecognizable face in a cracked piece of glass. I didn't want justice. Justice was for people who believed in the system. I wanted a reckoning. I scrolled through the contacts on the encrypted phone until I found a name I hadn't thought about in a decade. A man who specialized in invisible solutions for people with more money than options. My thumb hovered over the call button. I looked back out the small window toward the main house. Through the sheeting rain, I could see the silhouette of Madeline and Xavier dancing in the living room, silhouetted against the warm golden light of the chandelier. They looked so happy, so safe. They thought the storm was outside, never realizing that the real tempest was sitting in a dirt floor shack less than 100 yards away, holding a phone and a lifetime of resentment. I pressed the button. The line hissed with static for a few seconds before a low, sandpaper dry voice answered. "State your requirements," the voice said. I looked at the vials of poison, my fingers tracing the H-final label, and felt the last shred of my mercy dissolve into the rain-soaked night. "I need a team," I whispered into the receiver, my eyes locked on the dancing shadows in the window. "And I need them to understand that this isn't a hit. It's a lesson. I want them to feel every second of it." The voice on the other end didn't hesitate. "Budget. Unlimited." I replied, my voice gaining a terrifying clarity. "I'm paying for the kind of pain you can't describe in a police report." I ended the call and sat there in the dark, the satellite phone still glowing in my hand. I wasn't Holden the CEO anymore. I wasn't Holden the gardener. I was the architect of a slow-burning hell. I reached out and picked up one of the vials, turning it over in the dim light, watching the clear liquid swirl like a trapped spirit as the first real gust of wind slammed into the side of the shack, making the old wood shiver. The satellite phone went dark in my palm, but the heat from that single conversation was still coursing through my veins like a fever. I tucked the phone back into the Pelican case, clicking the latches with a finality that felt like snapping a pair of handcuffs. Before I go on, I have to ask you, have you ever reached a point where you realize that being the bigger person was just a polite way of saying you're willing to be a doormat? If you're waiting to see how a father handles a son who tried to kill him, make sure you've hit that notification bell. You're going to want to see how this ends. The next morning, the estate was a mess of fallen branches and washed-out gravel. I spent the afternoon near the garage, the very place where the betrayal had taken physical form. I watched Preston through the window of the workshop. He was leaning against my vintage Jaguar, smoking a cigarette and laughing with a girl on his speakerphone. "Yeah, the old man had zero style," Preston said, flicking ash onto the pristine concrete floor. I moved closer to the window, my shadow falling over the glass. Preston looked up, squinting through the reflection. For a split second, I didn't hide. I stood tall, the way I used to in the boardroom. "I know the brakes were faulty," I whispered. I know how the fluid leaks when someone tinkers with them. His face went pale. The arrogance drained out of him, replaced by a raw, naked fear. But the real discovery happened an hour later. I was supposed to be trimming the ivy on the side of the library, but I climbed the trellis to the second-floor balcony instead. I could hear Madeline's voice, sharp and frantic. Is the second dose ready? The probate is taking too long. If Holden's body is discovered soon, we need to make sure the toxicology report shows a heart failure induced by his pre-existing condition. We can't have any traces of the M-series in him. I retreated to the shack, but I didn't stay there. I went to the old well at the back of the property. Inside were the hard drives from the hidden security cameras I'd installed in my own office and the master bedroom cameras nobody knew about. I reached for the satellite phone. Tonight, I said when the voice answered. They're moving tonight. They're looking for a body. Give them one. But make sure it's the last thing they ever see coming. I watched as the lights in the library dimmed. I saw the back door open and 3 figures stepped out into the moonlight. Madeline, Xavier, and Preston. I pulled a small remote from my pocket, the one that controlled the perimeter lights. With a single click, I plunged the entire back half of the estate into total suffocating darkness. I moved through the trees, my footsteps silent on the moss. I stood in the center of the path, the moonlight filtering through the canopy and hitting my scarred face. Preston was the first to see me. He let out a choked gurgling sound, his knees hitting the ground as he stared up at the ghost of the man he'd tried to kill. Dad, he whispered the words sounding like a death rattle. I didn't say a word. I just stood there. A red laser dot appeared on the center of his forehead, held steady by a shadow in the trees. The red dot on Xavier's forehead pulsed like a tiny bleeding star, the only light in a forest that had suddenly become a tomb. He froze his hand halfway to his waistband, his face turning a shade of gray that matched the ash of the cigarettes my son used to smoke in my garage. Madeline's flashlight slipped from her numb fingers, hitting the mossy ground and casting a long, distorted beam that illuminated my boots, the heavy, mud-caked boots of a man they thought they'd buried. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was heavy like the air in a room just before a bomb goes off. I want to ask you one last thing, and I want you to really think about it. If you had the power to destroy the people who broke you, but it meant you could never go back to being the person you were before, would you pull the trigger? Would you choose a clean conscience or a cold, hard sense of justice? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because I'm still living with my choice every single day. And if you've stuck with me through this entire nightmare, thank you for being my witness. Hit that subscribe button, because this is how the story of Holden finally ends. Holden. Madeline's voice was a ragged whisper, stripped of all its polished charm. She took a trembling step toward me, her hands reaching out as if she were trying to touch a ghost. How is this possible? We thought, the accident. The accident your son staged? I asked, my voice flat and devoid of any fatherly warmth. I looked at Preston, who was still on his knees, his breath coming in sharp, jagged gasps. Or the slow-acting poison you've been stirring into my drinks for 6 months. Which accident are we talking about? Madeline? Xavier tried to find his voice, his eyes darting toward the shadows where my team was hidden. Holden, listen to me. This is a misunderstanding. We can talk about this. We can fix the accounts, The only thing you're fixing tonight is your final statement, I interrupted. The red dot on his forehead didn't waver. From the darkness, 4 figures emerged, men I'd paid more than Xavier's annual salary to ensure they were ghosts themselves. They didn't carry badges. They carried the weight of my bank account. I stepped closer until I was standing right over Preston. He looked up at me, tears streaming down his face, the face of a boy who had traded his father's life for a luxury car. I felt that Noi Jiao She Long, one last time, a sharp final snap of the bond that used to hold my heart together. I reached down not to hug him, but to pull the keys to the Jaguar out of his pocket. You didn't even wash the blood off the bumper, Preston, I whispered. You just drove it. I turned to the lead operative, a man who went by the name of Miller. He was standing perfectly still, his face masked, waiting for my word. Take them to the shack, I commanded. I want them to see where I've been living while they were dancing in my living room. The walk back to the service quarters was a procession of shadows. My family, the people I had built a life for, were now being herded like cattle by men they couldn't even see clearly. When we reached the dirt floor shack, I forced them inside. The smell of damp wood and my own sweat filled the small space. I sat on the thin, dusty mattress and watched them huddle together in the center of the room. "This is it," I said, gesturing to the cramped walls. "This was the retirement you planned for me. Only I had to work for it. I had to pull weeds and clean your toilets while you plotted how to find my corpse." Madeline started to sob, but it wasn't the sob of a grieving wife. It was the sob of a cornered animal. "Holden, please." I was scared. "Xavier, he convinced me you were going to leave us with nothing. He said you were hiding money." Xavier snarled at her, the mask of the sophisticated lover finally shattering. "Shut up, Madeline. You were the one who bought the vials. You were the one who said he was taking too long to die." I watched them turn on each other, their perfect alliance dissolving in the face of real consequences. It was pathetic. I realized then that I didn't want to go back. I didn't want to be the CEO of a company that funded these monsters. I didn't want the mansion or the suits. All of that was just bait for vultures. I pulled out the laptop and showed them the footage, the garage, the bedroom, the vials. I saw the moment the hope died in Madeline's eyes. She knew there was no legal way out. No judge she could bribe. "I'm not calling the police," I said, and for a second a flicker of relief crossed Xavier's face. "Because the police follow a set of rules that people like you know how to break. No, I'm going to do exactly what you did to me. I'm going to let the world think you're gone." I stood up and signaled to Miller. "The transfer is complete." Miller said, his voice a low drone. "Their accounts are empty. The property is in the name of a shell corporation. They officially don't exist." I walked out of the shack, leaving them with the men I hired. I didn't look back as the door slammed shut. I didn't listen to the pleas or the screams that were quickly muffled by the heavy rain that had started to fall again. I walked toward the main gate, my steps light the weight of the H-final toxin, finally feeling like it was lifting from my spirit, even if my body was still weak. I stopped at the edge of the driveway and looked back at the mansion. It was just a house. A big, cold, empty house built on the labor of a man who had forgotten what it meant to be truly alive. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the satellite phone, sending a final message to the team. Phase 2. Complete the hunt. Leave nothing but the memory. I walked past the gates and kept going. I didn't have a car, I didn't have a suit, but I had $2 million in a waterproof case in a world that had no idea I was coming. I was a ghost, a gardener, and a king all at once. As I reached the main road, the sun began to peek through the storm clouds, hitting the wet pavement and making it glow like a path of gold. I took a deep breath of the fresh, rain-washed air, feeling the grit of the garden still under my fingernails, a permanent reminder of the truth I'd found in the dirt. I didn't know where I was going, but for the first time in 20 years I knew exactly who I was. I reached the crest of the hill and paused, looking down at the valley where my old life lay in ruins. The silence was absolute save for the distant sound of a single car engine starting up somewhere far below, a sound that echoed like the first heartbeat of a new world. I adjusted the strap of the case on my shoulder and stepped forward into the light of the rising sun, the shadow I cast behind me finally long enough to cover everything I'd left behind.